In the latter years of King Henry VII's reign, the once mighty monarch who had ruled England with unwavering authority and had commanded vast power found himself a prisoner to his own body. The great king, who had been an imposing figure in his youth, a man of charisma, ambition, and ruthlessness, was now a shadow of the man he had once been. This was no longer the man who had forced his will upon the kingdom with the weight of his laws and demands. Instead, Henry was trapped in a deteriorating state of health, his once powerful body ravaged by disease and age. The very throne upon which he had once asserted divine rule now became a symbol of his fragility. Henry's final days were marked by a disturbing combination of physical suffering, political decay, and the crumbling of his own legacy. It was a decline that came at the expense of his power, his relationships, and his sense of self. The public spectacle of his waning health became an unavoidable focus for the court, and even for the kingdom. The image of the king, once known for his athleticism, his appetites, and his dominance, had been replaced by a bloated, almost unrecognizable figure. His once imposing stature was diminished, and he was forced to rely on a mechanical contraption to help him move. His physical decline mirrored the collapse of the grandeur he had carefully constructed throughout his reign. But beyond the visible changes in his body, Henry's mind and decision-making had also been profoundly affected. The once sharp, decisive ruler was now increasingly prone to erratic behavior, surrounded by a court that had become more concerned with self-preservation than loyalty to the crown. His marriage to Catherine Parr, his sixth wife, was tainted by suspicion and distrust. The unresolved issues within the royal family, particularly the question of succession, weighed heavily on him. And yet, despite his isolation, Henry remained convinced of his divine right to rule, even as the world around him seemed to fall apart. As his health continued to decline, his reign became marked by more internal strife than ever before. The political landscape was in flux, and many of the former allies who had once stood by his side were now at odds with one another. There was a growing sense of discontent, a realization that the foundation upon which Henry had built his power was no longer as solid as it had once appeared. The Tudors had seen their fair share of political intrigue and betrayal, but now it seemed as if the very fabric of the monarchy was beginning to unravel. This period of Henry's life was characterized by an overwhelming sense of fear, isolation, and the collapse of certainty. His body was no longer able to bear the weight of his ambition, and the end of his reign, marked by his deteriorating health, was fast approaching. Yet despite these challenges, Henry clung to his power, unwilling to relinquish control even as his mind and body betrayed him. The question on everyone's mind was not only how long Henry could continue to rule, but whether his kingdom would survive the immense personal crisis he was experiencing. His last days were characterized by a growing sense of dread. It was not just the physical pain of his ailments that consumed him, but the deep, emotional toll of watching his legacy slip through his fingers. Henry VIII had spent much of his life chasing greatness, forcing his way into the annals of history through dramatic decisions, including his break from the Roman Catholic Church. Yet in his final days, he was forced to confront the reality that his reign, once so full of promise, was ending not with the grandeur he had envisioned, but with humiliation and uncertainty. His diminishing power left a mark on the court, where factions now rose and fell with the slightest shift in his condition. Despite the political maneuvering, the growing mistrust among those who had once been his allies, Henry VII's decline remained the central focus. The once vibrant king, now imprisoned in his own failing body, was left to wrestle with the unsettling prospect of death. His court, which had once been filled with confidence and control, was now rife with fear and anxiety. The uncertainty of his health and the uncertain future of his reign cast a dark shadow over the kingdom. But for Henry, there was no clear resolution to the questions that surrounded him. His physical decline had reached its peak, but the fate of England remained undecided. Would his legacy be one of greatness, or would it be marred by the decay of the monarch who had once embodied power and authority? In these final days, Henry was forced to confront his mortality, but the outcome of his reign was not yet clear. He had fallen from his once unassailable position, and the world around him seemed to be crumbling. The final days of Henry VIII were a stark reminder of the fragility of power, and the end of a reign that had once seemed unstoppable. As Henry VII's health deteriorated further, his once iron grip on power began to loosen. No longer the confident monarch who had orchestrated the English Reformation, He was now a man struggling to maintain control over not just his body, but the kingdom he had built. In his final years, the stability of the Tudor dynasty seemed increasingly fragile, threatened not just by external forces, but by the deep cracks forming within his own court. Political maneuvers that had once been smooth and decisive were now marred by indecision and infighting. At the heart of this turmoil was the succession. Henry's long-held desire for a male heir had led to the tragic deaths of 2 wives and the tumultuous marriages that followed. But now, with his health failing and no clear successor in sight, his kingdom stood at the edge of uncertainty. The question of who would inherit the throne loomed over everything. Would his only male heir, Edward VI, succeed him, or would the throne fall into chaos? Henry's health had become an almost constant topic of conversation among the courtiers, who now saw an opportunity to secure their own positions. The king's condition was no secret. His once regal figure had become a grotesque sight. His face had swollen from obesity, and his leg ulcers, a result of his earlier jousting injuries, had become increasingly severe. The king was often confined to his bed, unable to move without assistance. His attendants, who had once served him with utmost loyalty, now scrambled to gain favor, sensing that his reign was nearing its end. Some hoped for the return of the powerful influence Henry had once wielded, while others saw this as an opportunity to quietly maneuver for control. Despite these internal struggles, Henry VIII refused to acknowledge his weakened state. His inability to physically attend to the matters of state and his retreat from the daily business of governance did little to ease the rising tensions among his courtiers. Even as he lay in bed, his mind, though clouded by illness, still clung to his belief in his divine right to rule. This conviction, so central to his earlier years, persisted despite his physical frailty, and his insistence on retaining control became a driving force in his court's machinations. In the midst of this chaos, his advisors and closest confidants, who had once been in awe of his power, now found themselves walking a delicate line. The council, which had been established to help rule during Henry's periods of incapacity, became a hotbed of intrigue. The old alliances that had once bound Henry's court together were now splintering, replaced by a struggle for influence over the king's successor. Some sought to support the claims of Henry's daughter Mary, others were quietly aligning themselves with his son Edward, and a few even entertained the possibility of a dynastic marriage that could circumvent the king's immediate family altogether. The political instability that characterized Henry's final years was not just a result of the king's deteriorating health, but a product of the very system he had built. The monarchy, once a unified institution of power, was now divided along personal and factional lines. The court was consumed by factionalism, as different groups jockeyed for position. No one could say for certain who would ultimately succeed the throne, but one thing was clear. The legacy of Henry VIII was becoming increasingly uncertain. As Henry's physical suffering continued to worsen, so too did the psychological toll it took on him. The once powerful monarch was now often overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness. His attempts to retain control over his kingdom seemed increasingly futile as he realized that his body was beyond his command. The pain from his infected wounds, his inability to move without assistance, and his increasing isolation from the court all weighed heavily on his psyche. In his final days, Henry was also haunted by the specter of his past decisions. The political and religious upheavals he had created throughout his reign seemed to be unraveling in front of him. The dissolution of the monasteries, his break from the Roman Catholic Church, and his relentless pursuit of a male heir had all led to the fragmentation of the political and religious landscape. What had once seemed like a great vision of a strong, independent England now appeared to be a kingdom divided and uncertain, struggling to maintain its footing in a rapidly changing world. Henry's attempts to hold onto his legacy through his children were fraught with difficulty. His son, Edward VI, was a child when Henry's health began to fail, and his chances of successfully ruling were slim without the guidance and support of a strong court. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were both seen as contentious heirs, and their claims to the throne were fraught with political complications. Mary was Catholic, a fact that made her unpopular with many Protestants, while Elizabeth's legitimacy was often questioned, a lingering consequence of the turmoil caused by Henry's own marital struggles. In the final months of Henry's reign, it became clear that his kingdom would face a period of uncertainty and instability. His refusal to acknowledge his own decline, coupled with the deeply fragmented political environment, made the future of the Tudor monarchy uncertain. The king's health, which had once been an afterthought in the grand scheme of statecraft, had become the central focus of every action at court. As Henry's last days drew nearer, the question remained: who would emerge from the shadows of his deteriorating reign to claim the crown? Henry VII's death marked not just the end of a king, but the culmination of a turbulent and fractious reign. The aftermath of his passing was shrouded in uncertainty, as the kingdom he had forged at great cost now faced the daunting question of survival without his towering presence. The echoes of his final days lingered across England, and the shock of his death sent ripples through the court, where factions still vied for power in the wake of his passing. At the time of Henry's death, the English monarchy was profoundly fractured. The once ironclad rule of the Tudors now seemed to hang in the balance. While Henry VIII had dominated the political landscape for nearly 4 decades, his death revealed the deep fissures within his court, each crack exposing the weaknesses he had been unable or unwilling to address in his final years. Though Henry had maintained control through sheer force of will, the system of monarchy he had built was no longer stable, and it would take more than the inherited power of his children to stabilize the realm. Henry's son, Edward VI, ascended to the throne, but at just 9 years old, he was ill-equipped to handle the complexities of governance. His reign, which would last only 6 years, would be dominated by a regency council, a body of powerful nobles who would clash over influence. This internal power struggle, combined with Edward's frail health, set the stage for future instability. Even in death, Henry's attempt to shape the succession was thwarted, as the very system that had upheld him collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. The political landscape of England continued to be defined by the fractured nature of Henry's reign. The religious reforms he had initiated, which had seemed so revolutionary, now faced their greatest challenges. Though Henry's break with the Catholic Church had created the Church of England, his death left the Protestant cause uncertain. Edward VI, a Protestant, would attempt to further reform the Church, but his death left the throne in the hands of the Catholic Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, whose reign would see a bloody return to Catholicism. The instability of religious factions in England, exacerbated by Henry's own inability to secure a lasting religious settlement, would continue to plague the monarchy long after his death. Meanwhile, Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, who would eventually inherit the throne, was also marked by the legacy of her father's reign. Elizabeth's ascent to power marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, one defined by a flourishing of culture and the stabilization of the monarchy. However, her reign, though widely celebrated, was not free from the shadows of her father's legacy. The question of legitimacy, of the division between Catholic and Protestant, would continue to haunt her throughout her life. Elizabeth was not merely the child of Henry. She was also his legacy, and the weight of that legacy was immense. Her success as a ruler, in large part, stemmed from her ability to navigate the fractured world Henry had left behind. In the wake of Henry's death, the physical space he had occupied, his palaces, his courtrooms, and his chambers, were left to echo with the weight of his decisions. The opulent halls of Hampton Court, where Henry had once held court with grandeur and spectacle, now stood empty, symbolic of the monarchy's fragility. His grand estates, once symbols of his power, were now a reminder of what had been lost. Even the physical remnants of Henry's reign, his tomb, for example, tell a story of a man whose final days were marked by an obsessive desire to secure his place in history. Henry had spent considerable resources constructing a tomb for himself that reflected his grandeur, a monumental display of wealth and power. Yet in death, the grandiosity of this tomb could not shield the monarchy from the unraveling he had set in motion. His burial in St. George's Chapel, alongside his beloved Jane Seymour, was a final act of romanticism, a brief respite from the unrelenting political currents that would follow. Though his physical legacy endured, the questions about his reign and the repercussions of his decisions would remain for centuries. What did Henry leave behind? He left a kingdom divided, politically, religiously, and morally. The image of the king who had once been the very symbol of England's power now seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by the political and social upheaval he had inadvertently triggered. His attempts to secure a legacy through his children, through the church, and through his own image were ultimately undermined by the very forces of instability he had sown. In the end, Henry VII's reign was not a clean-cut tale of triumph, but a story of complexity, ambition, and tragedy. His final days, marked by suffering, confusion, and isolation, symbolized the slow unraveling of a monarchy that had been built on ambition, but could not endure the weight of its own contradictions. The kingdom that had once been dominated by his presence was now left to pick up the pieces, each faction fighting to secure its own version of the future. His death left a vacuum, not only in terms of power, but also in terms of identity. The kingdom had lost its larger-than-life figure, but it had not yet found the direction it so desperately needed. The legacy of Henry VIII, therefore, was one of uncertainty, a kingdom in flux, and a monarchy at the crossroads. And while the immediate aftermath of his reign was marked by power struggles and political intrigue, it would take the determined efforts of those who followed him to stabilize England's future. Henry VIII's final days had cast long shadows, and his legacy, both powerful and fractured, would be felt for generations.